Hi everyone, my name is Steph, this is the Novelty Corner, and today I have some Hades and Persephone book recommendations for you. For those of you who don't know, I am a big fan of a Hades and Persephone retelling. It is a type of retelling, but it's basically a trope in and of itself now, because I think there are so many of them out there. I have not read all of them, I have read a lot of the popular ones, and today I thought I would combine them into a video for anyone who is unfamiliar with it. So my romance reader friends, this is probably not going to be any kind of surprise for you guys, but anyone else who is intrigued, this might give you a starting point. If you're unfamiliar, Hades and Persephone is a Greek myth. Hades is the god of the underworld, and the basic story goes that he saw Persephone, she's incredibly beautiful, and he decided to take her to the underworld and keep her there with him. Persephone's mother, Demeter, was not happy about this and essentially created a drought to try and convince the other gods to convince Hades to let Persephone go. This is obviously a very simplistic overview of their myth, and you can definitely read more about it, but these are the general sort of themes that you might come across. There are different stories on how Persephone was released and what her contractual agreement was to stay in the underworld. So there are some stories that say that Hades fed her a pomegranate seed to compel her to return. There are others that said that if she ate anything from the underworld, then she would be bound to return there. And then of course there is an agreement struck where she spends part of her time in the underworld and part of her time out of the underworld, and that varies anywhere between a third of the year to half of the year at any given point. Obviously, this kind of story is like catnip for romance readers and romance writers because you really have initially a captor-captive sort of situation. It's quite dark. You have the idea of a very dark character or seemingly dark character like Hades compared to the light of Persephone. Persephone as a goddess can make things grow, whereas the underworld is meant to be quite barren. You also have the idea of a beautiful woman bringing a dark man to his knees, and the whole idea is just fantastic and great for creating stories and retellings based around it. Part of the reason that I quite like the story, aside from the character dynamics between Hades and Persephone, is also this idea of the underworld being misunderstood, just like perhaps Hades himself is misunderstood, particularly since most people think the underworld is where all the bad people go, whereas Hades was also responsible for Elysium, which was the heaven place as well, which is based in the underworld. So you have all of these ideas where quite often many characters in these books perceive that underworld character as being something other than he is as a result of, you know, what he is responsible for. To that end, I have a bunch of recommendations that I have categorized in if you like this kind of story, then this is a recommendation for it. And then at the very end, I also have some books that are on my radar as things that I would like to read that are Hades and Persephone retellings themselves. So I'm going to start off with, you know, some of the obvious ones. If you like a whimsical, amazing graphic novel, then you need to read Lore Olympus by Rachel Smythe. I myself am very, very behind on this, but I have also pre-ordered the physical copy of the printed book. So I'm probably going to wait until that comes out and then start catching up that way. The artwork in this is absolutely incredible. It is basically a what do the gods do after dark, and it is just stunning. There are some heavy themes in here. Obviously with the Hades and Persephone myth, there's always some heavy themes that do thread their way through the books, but it is well worth reading, and everything that is mentioned is handled really, really well. I kind of can't talk about a Hades and Persephone retelling without mentioning the next book, which is if you like a fantasy romance book, then you will probably want to try A Court of Mist and Fury. Now, this one I would not recommending without having read A Court of Thorns and Roses first, because the Hades and Persephone retelling really relies on that story being embedded in your brain before you pick this one up. Everyone and their mother knows about Sarah J Maas and the Court of Thorns and Roses series. It's about Feyre, who kills a fae in her realm who is in stag form, and the punishment is that she needs to leave her family and live in the fae world as recompense. There's a whole lot of things that happen in that first book that lead up to this book, where she finds herself indebted to spending time in the Night Court with its Dark Fae Lord Rhysand. This is where you have that aspect of she has to divide her time between two places, between two men. The Hades character Rhysand is depicted as everyone believing him to be dark, bad, all of those sorts of things, whereas you eventually discover that maybe that perception is all a front and that there is a lot more going on beneath the surface. If you want a darker or slightly more taboo Hades and Persephone retelling, you probably want to pick up Neon Gods by Katie Robert. This is not super dark or super taboo, but it does sort of lean into some of those elements, but being traditionally published, it probably doesn't go to the same depth as some of Katie Roberts' other books. That said, it is incredibly steamy, and this is the story of Persephone, who is the daughter of Demeter, and she's weeks away from her birthday and escaping her family for good and leaving Olympus. But at a party, it is announced that Persephone is going to be the next Hera and marry Zeus. So in this story, there is absolutely no magic. It is very much sort of a mafia style world where the gods are called the 13. Some of them are elected to their office, and others, like Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon, are legacy titles that are passed down through family lines. Persephone is not particularly thrilled with being betrothed to Zeus because most of Zeus's wives have either gone missing or turned up dead. As a result, she runs away from Olympus and she crosses the river Styx into Hades territory. And Hades is a member of the 13 that everyone believes has been lost, that he's no longer spoken about, but she discovers that he is real, and together they hatch a plan to bring down Zeus. There are really fantastic steamy scenes in here. I really enjoyed this series. It does tie in to the Wicked Villain series. So Learn My Lesson is not a Hades and Persephone retelling, but it does feature a Hades. And if you've read this one first, you'll know how it connects to Neon Gods. This is a throuple story between Hades, Hercules, and Megara. These two do link. I would recommend reading both, and preferably reading this one first, because some of the history that comes up in this book is referenced in the first book. That said, you can read it on its own. If you want a Hades and Persephone retelling that feels a little bit more urban fantasy in its storytelling style, then I would recommend A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. This is also quite dark and very steamy, but this one is set in a world that's like ours. However, the gods are gods, and they have taken on slightly new personas and they influence society in different ways. So Hades in this world is running a gambling empire and he's constantly striking deals with people. And Persephone is a budding reporter and she hears about this, and so she decides to go and investigate and unintentionally finds herself entering into a contract with Hades where she has to bring life to the underworld or she will be trapped there forever. Well worth checking out. This is a series. You can probably read the first book and be fine with that story. It does feel complete enough on its own, but the other stories are fun as well. If you want a short and steamy Hades and Persephone retelling, I would recommend Hot as Hades by Alicia Rai. In this story, a naked Persephone is quite literally dropped in Hades' lap, and Hades himself really doesn't want a bar of the rest of the world. He hides away, he likes his solitude, but this naked goddess lands in his lap and he's told that he has to keep her there and keep her safe. And despite the fact that he's been told this, it's not high on his priority list. I think the tagline on Goodreads is, he is an arrogant god, she is a stubborn goddess, and when they get together the sparks fly. It is super steamy, it is super short, and Alicia Rai did a great job with it. If you want a historical romance Hades and Persephone retelling, I would suggest A Rogue by Any Other Name by Sarah MacLean. This was actually the first Sarah MacLean book that I ever read. This one features the Marquess of Bourne, who is an outcast from London high society, and now he co-runs an exclusive gaming hell in London. In order to gain his inheritance, he finds himself having to marry Lady Penelope Marbury. He tries to keep her untainted by what he does, and yet she finds herself being drawn into his world and to sort of the wickedness behind it, despite his best efforts. And as she uncovers more, she finds herself being lured in, and it's just great. I'm glad that this was my first Sarah MacLean book because I loved it. If you want a Hades and Persephone retelling with diverse characters, I would suggest Drag Me Up by R.M. Virtues. This is a Hades and Persephone retelling where Persephone is trans. She is also a circus performer. She has a lead role in Calliope's Cirque production, which is currently being hosted at one of the venues that Hades owns. So he owns a casino called Asphodel. The performance is taking place there, and that's where he stumbles across her. What we find out is that Persephone is largely in debt to Zeus, and he is tightening the reins on her, whereas she wants freedom and Hades wants to be the one that frees her. This one was slightly different to some of the other books on this list. It is quite dark. I probably didn't have the best sense of the world from this one. It is the first book in a series, but I did really enjoy sort of some of the elements that R.M. Virtues had woven into the story, particularly this idea of how Persephone and Hades meet. So definitely worth checking out to see if it's something that you're interested in. And then the final recommendation is, if you like romantic suspense, then I would suggest The Devil's Daughter by Katie Robert. There's a few Katie Robert books in here. Clearly she likes writing Hades and Persephone retellings. This is about Eden Collins, who grew up the daughter of a cult leader in a small town in Montana. The cult is a Persephone cult, and she escaped as a child and now she works for the FBI. However, she finds out that bodies are turning up in this town bearing a tattoo that identifies them as a member of her mother's cult. And so she returns to the town to try and sort out what's going on. There she meets Sheriff Zach Owens, who is really reluctant to draw her back into this world, particularly into the world of her mother and her past. And yet he knows that she is really the best placed person to find out what's going on. I did not go into this book expecting it to be a Hades and Persephone retelling, but it kind of was, and it was great. So for some of the other books that are on my radar, I don't know a whole lot about them. There is Hades and Persephone Curse of the Golden Arrow by Heidi Hastings, which I heard about I think it must have been a few years ago, and that has been on my TBR for a while. Infernal by Lindsay Hall, which is another one that's been on my TBR for a while. Promises and Pomegranates by Sav R. Miller is a new one. I know Izzy from Happy For Now talked about it recently, and this one she described as being really dark and kind of out there. So I'm very intrigued by this one, but I know I'll have to go into it knowing to expect the unexpected, I think. And then another one that I have is King of Shadows by Amelia Wilde. And I think that I have potentially read the prequel story to this one, so at some point I will come back to it and see if I enjoy the first full-length novel. If you have any other recommendations for Hades and Persephone books, feel free to leave them in the comments, or feel free to let me know if you have read any of these ones and what your thoughts are on them. If you want to let me know that you're here but you don't want to leave a comment, feel free to leave any kind of flower emoji. I hope that wherever you're in the world, you're staying safe and healthy, and I will see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.